Good morning, everyone. Happy July. I hope you all had a great long weekend. Passing Canada Day and the 4th of July. Everyone hopefully got to spend some time with their family and enjoy the weather. Barbecuing, picnics, you name it. On that note, we're talking about phosphate today, and you might kind of scratch your head and say, well, what on earth has that got to do with barbecuing, picnicking? Because we're talking about food. We're talking about food supply, fertilizer, how we grow it, and why it's critical, why it's such a key thing to look at right now. And we're talking about a bunch of different scenarios around this, because if you put into YouTube or into Google food supply shortage, you're going to find a lot of information. A lot of it's clickbait, but a lot of good information as well. And phosphate, and specifically we're talking with President of Arianne Phosphate, Brian Ostroff today, is phosphate stimulates root growth, or phosphorus stimulates like flowers blooming, seed development, and it's an essential component of DNA and RNA, cell membrane, sugars, carbohydrates, etc. And plants just don't grow without it, and there's no substitute for it. So when you're dealing with all these issues, we have to look at where is this fertilizer coming from. So we're going to talk a little bit about fertilizer, how it affects supply chain, where we're sitting at right now, and once again, where do we find ourselves in these commodity markets and looking for opportunities? And everyone knows I like looking for unique situations. And this one came across my plate about 10 days ago. And I was just really enthralled with the conversation. And we're so thrilled to have you on, Brian, to kind of teach us, get us up to speed on what's happening, and set this stage as to where Arianne sits and really this whole market of phosphate and how it works with fertilizers and food supply.
Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. Look, to your point, I think that this is a topic that is important. A lot of people take it for granted. They go to the supermarket or the corner store whenever they need something. It's there. They've probably noticed prices have gone up. We'll touch on that in a little bit. But, by and large, I think it's something that's taken for granted. And, I often say this, look, we're in the commodity world. My background is commodities. And look, I get it. Gold is sexy. Oil is sexy. But at the end of the day, you can't eat gold. You can't drink oil. This is what really matters. And so, I think people should pay attention. So, kind of the quick macro, phosphate, like nitrogen and potash are used in fertilizer. 85% of phosphate does make its way into fertilizer. I think the investor makes a bit of a mistake here. He sees all three, they're all in fertilizer, doesn't take the time to maybe understand the differences. Yeah, sure, prices will trend together. But if you want to outperform, you should really know the difference. And I would certainly argue that phosphate maybe is the weakest link of the three. So as I've said, 85% of this stuff winds up in fertilizer, but it's also in foods as preservatives. If your listeners, they eat deli, they drink Diet Coke. I mean, that's all phosphate. So, you need this stuff. They're even now making their ways into the electric vehicles, batteries, lithium iron phosphate batteries.
Yeah.
And so, look, one of the other things I had said earlier, gold, and that's sexy and what have you. One of the things about gold is, or most commodities, you dig them out of the ground wherever, Nevada, British Columbia, Argentina, it's all the same. It all trades at the same price. Phosphate really can differ deposit to deposit. I won't bore you guys with geology right now, but the key takeaway is most of the world's phosphate comes from sedimentary deposits. And in those deposits, you have a lot of bad things. You have radioactive elements, you have heavy metals. And look, again, we're talking about food. You
Yes.
don't want this stuff in the food chain. But, to your point earlier, we also don't want to starve. And there is no substitution to phosphate, so we try and deal with it. Now, there are these rare deposits, of which Arianne's very fortunate to have, that are igneous. There's maybe a dozen in the world, and they don't have any issues with radioactive elements or heavy metals. And so, look, that's a big plus. That's a big plus for the health of our food chain, for the health of people. You know, one of the other differences, and you had that on that chart earlier, you know, unlike gold that maybe trades at the same price everywhere in the world all the time, phosphate, you get paid for your quality. So typically the type of phosphate that Arianne will produce trades at about a 50% premium over that of kind of your regular everyday phosphate. And so, look, you know, where's this stuff come from? We know it's important. Everyone in the world uses it. I'd said earlier, each of the markets, the phosphate, the nitrogen, the potash, they all have their own supply-demand dynamics. Look, you know, when you look at phosphate, North America runs a deficit, and South America runs a deficit, Western Europe runs a deficit, and a lot of Asia runs a deficit. India is the world's largest importer. China looks like they might be heading for deficit. So by and large, the world is short. And, you know, unlike a lot of other commodities as well, demand grows every
year. Yes, yes.
Every year. And so, you know, we're all short. We're getting shorter. And so where do we get the stuff from? We get the stuff from the Middle East and North Africa. Morocco is by far the world's largest. Look, that's a good address in an otherwise neighborhood that, you know, historically has been fairly volatile. Tunisia used to be the world's second largest. They had an Arab Spring. It still hasn't come back. So, you know, basically the world is short, and we're dependent on MENA, Middle East and North Africa, to make up that short. So, look, I think that each region would really prefer to have that stuff internally.
Yes.
And so, look, I think the world needs to realize here in North America, we need to realize that we are reliant on the Middle East and North Africa for some of the phosphate. I mean, Florida is a large region in terms of production, but it's still, it's not enough. And so the world needs more, is going to continue to need more. Again, demand grows every single year, and this stuff matters. Sure, we don't find more cobalt. Maybe there's not, maybe everyone doesn't get a Tesla, but again, we're all going to want to eat.
Yes. That's, I mean, it's hitting home that absolute crucial need for something, and people they take it for granted. They think, where does my food come from? I just go to the store, buy it. But COVID gave people a little bit of a shock, a little bit of a shock to the system when they realized maybe I should stock up for a couple of weeks. That caused a bit of supply chain issues. And then also just the supply chains that going forward, and we see that a lot is coming from Middle East, is shipping costs are going to increase with whatever new rules, implementation, guidelines for shipping that will come. I know for, generally speaking, for most mining companies, they're looking for projects back, quote unquote, home, whereas they understand the regulations, even if it costs a bit more because of the supply chain issue. And here we have a project that's basically at home, I'd say North America, easier to transport, easier to get out, rather than shipping from one place to another. And when people start to see, okay, how do we farm? It's not, you know, Uncle Jack's little farm at the end of the road. That's not farming anymore. There's a reason why, you know, Bill Gates is buying up all this farmland. It's a critical, fundamental thing. And I think people are being forced to take a step away from all this innovation, all those great things that's happening, to look at the core of what do we need? Food, water. We need some core stuff here. And that's really been brought up to the forefront. And that's what really impressed me with the presentation, was this macro outlook towards how do we make food? This is the fertilizer. You can't run the kind of sustainable food that we have to make without fertilizer. It just doesn't exist. So it's not a matter of, well, is there a substitute? There's not. So we have to do it this way. And this, you're sitting on a, like, I guess, equivalent of high grade fertilizer. And that's very distinctly different than what's out there in other places.
You know, it's interesting because you talk about the supply chain. For all of it, we've gotten used to the whole concept of just-in-time delivery. Now, the interesting thing about just-in-time delivery is that works as long as you can get your stuff just in time. And all of a sudden, COVID comes along. The truck drivers are hard to get. The migrant workers to work the fields are not there. You know, you get outbreaks in the slaughterhouses, and you know, all of a sudden in big urban populations, you went into the supermarket and look, the shelves weren't empty, but they were noticeably thinner. And you know, I think that it has caused a rethink. And look, people really should pay attention because, again, it does matter. You know, the other thing that's interesting is, you know, I'm going to put on my market hat a little bit here. Look, ag cycles last a very long time. You know, when you look at phosphate fertilizer prices, their last cycle high was 2012, basically went down for 7 years, 2019, end of 2019, and they started to turn up. You know, we're only about a year and a half into this thing, and we're still a decent ways off of prices that we saw in the last ag cycle. I think one of our charts kind of shows some pricing, but you know, here's the thing that people I think should be aware of. I'm sure a lot of them are, particularly if they're commodity guys. But the last time ag prices, the last cycle high, US M2 was $8 trillion.
Yeah.
Today, US M2 is roughly $20 trillion.
20 trillion.
So, you know, we've seen a lot of commodities go to all-time highs. We've seen equities go to all-time highs. We've seen real estate go to all-time highs. I think you'd be pretty naive to think that ultimately food isn't going to all-time highs. And so, you know, as you can see by that chart, look, you know, phosphate fertilizer prices, DAP, have had a nice move, but we're only back to kind of where we were 2014. You know, and interestingly, what caused that move? You know, they say the cure to a low commodity price is a low commodity price. For 7 years, prices came down and down. No one was expanding. As far as development, Arianne was really the only large-scale project continuing to move forward. Exploration, no one did anything because you had 7 years. And as we've said earlier, demand grows every single year. So for 7 years, no increase to supply. Demand grows, demand grows, demand grows. You get to that tipping point, and you start to see that move up. And so also what allows for that, it's farmer affordability. So the farmer ended 2020 in his best point for affordability of fertilizer that he was since 2003. And so he can handle that. He can handle even higher prices. And so why is that? If you go to the next slide, the answer there is, as you can see, grain prices. You know, grain prices have moved. It definitely has given the farmer the ability to pay more and more for fertilizer. But as you can also see, even though we've had nice moves, we're not even back to next cycle, or I'm sorry, last cycle highs. And so I still think there's room. You know, I'm just going to touch on one other thing. You know, you look at those charts and it's very easy. Look, we're market guys, and you kind of look at the chart. You don't necessarily think about the human factor. And, you know, if you take a look back in 2010, 2011 was the last time that the grains kind of did this. You know, I talked earlier about Arab Spring. You know, Arab Spring didn't happen because people woke up after 30 years under dictatorship and wanted to change a regime. You know, this unrest came the last time that the grain prices shot up. And so again, look, you know, by and large here in North America, we're fortunate. It's you know, food prices are definitely on the climb, big time.
Yeah,
it's an inconvenience, but it's not life-threatening, which is where it is in a lot of other places in the world. And so this thing's going to matter. There's going to be reverberations, and you know, I was really young at the time, but I definitely remember the last inflation spike. I remember the oil embargo when things weren't going too well with the Middle East.
Yeah,
and you know, the front line of that this time around could be fertilizer and food. I don't know. We're going to have to figure it out.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about inflation. I know, Austin, we've talked quite a bit.
Yeah.
And you even brought up that you've noticed pricing just yourself, and it's an inconvenience. We've got, you know, we live in British Columbia and Alberta, and you go, oh, okay, I noticed that food's gone up and that there's inflation and whatnot. But that's very different. Like when you look at it, say, from the World Economic Forum, where they're talking about the world. So usually if we read an article, we think it's about us, and you go, no, the rest of the world that already has issues that are far greater than ours. When you now implement that there's less phosphate going in, that there's less trade, that I think you had even mentioned that, parts of the Middle East were actually importing as well phosphate because they weren't producing it. Well, then you add on the supply chain on top of that. That's a large portion of populations, ex-Canada, US, that are under serious constraint and critical constraint. And that is, once again, life-threatening. It's not just a simple fact of, okay, I can stock up for a little while and maybe I don't get to pick the things I want. It's no, this is life and death.
Yeah, look, absolutely. You know, one of my challenges, I guess, I don't know if you know mythology, but Cassandra. Cassandra was this mythological figure, and she could see the future, but she could see only bad things. So she would go around, she'd tell people, and she'd say, you know, you got to get out of this town. That volcano is going to erupt. You know, you got to go. You know, people don't like hearing bad news. So, you know, her curse was the fact that she could see things coming that weren't going to be good, but no one would listen because people don't really like paying attention to things that aren't good.
Yes.
And so, look, we definitely have some challenges. Again, in here, North America, the Western world, things are going to get a lot more expensive, but we'll survive. You know, what happens in some other places, I don't know.
No, and I bring it up just as far as a market. I mean, to me, I look at there's we're responsible for ourselves, our family, and our community around. Once you go past the tertiary and fourth realm, you know, I can't have an effect on someone in China and India and whatnot. We live in an interconnected world with YouTube and stuff, but that's not the same thing. I can take responsibility for my current environment. I think that's what we're quote unquote responsible for. So in that context is, once again, here's a Canadian project that's very unique that is being ignored. You know, and that's the stuff that, you know, even Warren Buffett would say, I don't want to go into a massively over competitive market that everyone's in. Like, I don't want to be an EV maker right now. I don't want to, you know, you need hundreds of billions of dollars to make electric cars. It's not a market I want to be in. I want to look for the one that's being neglected, forgot, but that's critical. And those situations don't come along all the time. This is this weird situation that's unfolding. And that is what I like to focus on is I talked about helium before. Everyone knows I love helium with Desert Mountain Energy. It has a very specific use and need. This is another one that thankfully has come to my attention that you go, oh, wait a second. I've been seeing a lot about, supply chain, food shortage. How's our food coming? How is it made and whatnot? And that I think is so critical to see that there's someone sitting in Canada, and especially Quebec, which is very mining friendly. You're fully cashed up as well. I think, let me get this right, 5.7 million raised.
Yeah, we just closed on a financing about 3 weeks ago, $5.75 million. So, we're in a good place. We won't have to go back to the market for quite some time.
And like the province of Quebec's in that as well. Like you've got key players. I mean, that's what's great about Quebec on top of many things is they fully understand on the mining front, whether it's for food or for EVs and all that, they're on it. They're you don't need to convince them, and that's really good.
Yeah, talking about the project itself, first and foremost, it is ideally located, as you said, it's the province of Quebec. The infrastructure, that's a great slide. That kind of says a lot. The necessary infrastructure is in place. There's a hydroelectric dam, renewable source of energy. Obviously, being Quebec, that energy from hydro is very reasonably priced. Oversized haul roads already in place. So we really are fortunate because a lot of times you have these big bulk tonnage deposits that are truly in the middle of nowhere, that your first $2 billion that you're going to spend is just going to be putting in roads and power and all the other infrastructure. So we're good. And the deposit's enormous. Actually, if you go to the next slide, that's unfortunate. It didn't come out, but when you look at our resource, so our feasibility study had a 26-year life of mine at 3 million tons a year. Yes. 3 million tons a year is a good size mine. Yeah. Subsequent to that, we did more drilling, and we've drilled off close to 50 years. So today, Arianne has the world's single largest greenfield deposit. I would argue that it is in the safest jurisdiction, and we make an incredibly pure concentrate. So again, we don't have issues with the radioactive elements or heavy metals. Our phosphate can be used not only in fertilizer, but can be used in food preservatives, lithium iron phosphate batteries for cars. So when you're talking about Arianne, you really, if I were to boil it down, largest, safest, purest.
Nice. Yes.
Tough to beat.
And also, I'll throw in there the governance, because ESG is such a big factor. You've thought that through very well. You work hand in hand for quite some time with the different tribal groups and bands up there as well. So you've got strong relationships. I know sometimes out west, those can be a bit more challenging, but that isn't an obstacle for you as well. Yeah, no,
we're so as I mentioned, for 7 years, you basically had a downturn in the industry. Arianne, was very fortunate. We were able to advance this project. Today, we are a fully permitted, shovel-ready project. As you'd mentioned, we have good support from the Quebec government. They are a large shareholder of ours. They've indicated their, willingness to help see this project come to fruition. We have a collaboration agreement with the First Nations. So, this is really the next large-scale phosphate mine to come on stream. And I should mention that 85% of the world's phosphate mines are actually owned by the guys who make the downstream, the fertilizer.
Okay, yeah.
And, what we've seen this time around is the guys who have had the excess phosphate concentrate, the phosphate rock, so the Moroccans, the Saudis, the Russians, they're expanding their own fertilizer operations. So what that means is the guys who are reliant on third-party phosphate concentrates, so that's some of the bigger North American guys, some of the Western guys, the Indians, the Chinese, there's less and less of that because it's being consumed by these expanded vertically oriented operations. So Morocco, again, being the world's largest, they are building out more fertilizer factories. They are taking more of their own phosphate concentrate. That means that that phosphate concentrate isn't available to someone. So people need to figure out where are they going to get the phosphate concentrate so that they can make fertilizer. And so Arianne is projected to be the only large-scale independent source of phosphate rock looking to come into the market over the next few years. So look, again, biggest, purest, safest, shovel-ready, well-placed, necessary commodity. You know, I think it's tough to ask for more.
Yes. And a lot of people will remember like the potash run that we had years back, and people can liken it to it. I like to compare things often, but you know, that's a similar but different type of scenario to look at. Is this setting up? And it seems to be, it looks like that to be the same kind of scenario where we can have this with phosphate. And once again, it's critical. We have to have it. It's not a matter of, you know, can we use something else? And I asked that before, but also, you know, because of the downturn and it's these long cycles, is that a lot of competitors are wiped out as well. Like even when I'd asked you previously and early before the show, like who else is out there? I mean, I would have to go really look for someone to say locally North America kind of thing. You know, who else is around? Who, never mind who could come on stream.
Yeah, you know, look, bear markets will do that, and you know, ultimately there's less and less interest. The ability for companies that are in the exploration or development stage to attract investors to get that money that you need to advance the projects, that goes away, and we lose a lot of assets or potential assets along the way, and so. Again, Arianne's very fortunate. The company has been able to advance its project during what was an incredibly difficult time. And so today, as that macro is now turned, and again, you know, phosphate fertilizer prices are up about 2.5-fold over the last 18 months. So sleepy fertilizer sometimes isn't so sleepy. And you know, we've been fortunate, but that said, I'd argue that would-be investors are even more fortunate. You know, there's that age-old philosophical question: if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? And I would argue not. And I think that's very true of the equity markets, especially in small cap stocks. You know, if people aren't paying attention to a situation, it doesn't matter what that company is doing. Sometimes it's just lost. And I think in looking at Arianne, you know, you were talking about the last kind of potash run, fertilizer run, you know, people paid attention, people cared. You know, back then, Arianne had $160 million market cap. This was before we did any serious drilling to know how big our deposit was, let alone the metallurgy and how pure. And you know, the industry turned down. And for 7 years, it went like this. So as Arianne kind of got better and better, got our permits, got off takes, you know, the whole thing, fewer and fewer people were watching, fewer and fewer people cared. You know, back 2011, 2012, Arianne had analyst coverage from 5 different firms. Yeah. Today, nobody carries.
Nobody. Yeah.
So, you know, today we've got an $80 million market cap. We are half of
with
what
all the work.
You know, despite all the advancements. So look, I know
this is what I like. This down. Unfortunately for your downside is such
what makes it super attractive. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is all this work. You're getting a discount.
Someone could come in 8 years, 9 years after, with a lot of these question marks no longer there.
Yep.
And come in at half the valuation.
Yep.
Today, if we were in production, gross profit, we'd be making somewhere in the neighborhood of a little over $300 million a year US.
Holy.
We're trading at an $80 million Canadian market cap.
Yeah. And this is the fascinating story. And it's such a big topic, but that's why I wanted it on, because of the situation that you have right now, and people aren't paying attention. This is why it's great, because you can kind of get in ahead of the curve on this one. Is that we were going to want to have you on at least a couple more times, because it's so big for people to get their heads wrapped around, and we wanted to introduce people to it, to say, hey, listen, here's a sector, you got to be paying attention. They can kind of spend 10 seconds to go find out the amount of information out there on food shortage and food supply, and then kind of listen to this again and go, oh yeah, this is kind of forgotten, and no one's really paying attention. And those are the markets that people can really do well. And it's going to buoy you against inflation. Right away, is that what's my proxy for this? And having a company like yourselves that could very well be a very good solution to help one's portfolio. Yeah,
look, absolutely. And, inflation's here. You and I joked a little earlier before we were online. I always laugh when the government puts out the inflation statistics, the CPI, and they'll quote, CPI was up, whatever, X food and energy.
Yeah.
Andrew, I don't know about you, but it's pretty difficult in my life to live X food and energy. So to go and discount that,
yeah.
I just don't understand that. And so, to your point, look, people should really look at how to protect themselves.
Yeah.
Where's inflation going to be? It's going to be everywhere. Where's it going to affect them, particularly in food?
Yes.
Kind of need to hedge that off. And there aren't a whole lot of ways to do it. You can buy the big caps, the mosaics, the
mosaic,
and that. But if you're really looking for torque,
yes,
you want to look at development stories and the harsh times, the famine over the last few years in the sector really has slowed down the progress of a lot of other projects. So, you had mentioned we'd done a financing we closed on it 3-4 weeks ago. There was big institutional demand, and you were seeing it from guys who, understand what's starting to happen in the ag world. There was an interesting article a few weeks ago in the Financial Times, their weekend edition, talking about how fertilizer companies have emerged out of a 9-year funk. People are looking, and there's just not that many names out there. And I think Arianne's in a good place here.
And that torque, that's what really interests us. I mean, can Mosaic double? Yeah, it could. And I'm not projecting price in it, but it's certainly a lot easier for a company to go from 60 cents to $1.20 than $35 to 70.
Absolutely.
It's a lot easier.
Well,
so that torque and grind is yes.
So that's the article that again, I think there's this growing realization even amongst institutional investors that something's up. You do look at the big caps. Look, Mosaic stock has done well. It's had a nice move off of the bottom. The Van Eck Agribusiness ETF, which trades in New York, is up near record highs. Of course, that will have the seed companies as well, and the farming equipment, etc. But they're up. I think people are trying to figure out how else And again, I think when you're looking at phosphate, development, what projects are out there, Arianne's very, very well placed.
Perfect. Well, like I said, there's so much, and we want to tackle the broad strokes, and there's a lot more detail that we'd love to get into. And I also encourage people to send us some comments and send us some questions, and we'll get back to you. But this, when I heard it, I was like, we have to get you on as soon as possible because it's happening, and these are the types of stories that I'm always interested in. When you see what's happening out there in the world, you put it all together and you go, oh, okay, what's the component piece of this and how is this working with this? You see, okay, yes, food is critical right now. It's in the news a lot. How can I position myself, and where's a great place for, especially a Canadian investor, to look in their backyard at a resource company and go, okay, yeah, I should pay attention. So I really appreciate you spending time with us, educating us and telling us about the whole sector, the market, and especially the opportunity there is with Arianne Phosphate.
Great. Well, look, I really, really appreciate it. Appreciate the time, and as you said, at the end of the day, I think that this is something pretty vital.
Beautiful. Well, thanks so much. Have a great day, everyone. Take care.
Take care. Thank you.